This is episode 100 of the Magic Detective Podcast. On this episode, you'll hear about the life of the enigmatic Dr. Edward Saint. That and more on this episode of the Magic Detective Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Magic Detective Podcast, your podcast home for magic history. I'm your host, Dean Carnegie. I am the Magic Detective, and this is episode 100. Well, today is a day to celebrate. Firstly, it's episode 100, but more than that, we have broken the 50,000 download mark. Now, I realize Joe Rogan probably gets 50,000 downloads in his first 20 minutes of his show, but I've got a slightly smaller audience. So it's very exciting. And think about it. I have no advertisers at the moment. It's all basically word of mouth and a few social media posts. I haven't done any advertising. The only thing I did do was a sort of an exchange of information with a very big name in the business. And well, they didn't follow up on their end. I promoted their podcast and they never mentioned mine. Whatever. Still, I did want 100 to be a big episode, and I had a lot of kind of grandiose ideas, but none of them felt like really what I wanted. Wasn't quite big enough. So instead, I'm just continuing on with the podcast as normal. There is a little bonus to this one, but I didn't want to wait any longer. Oh, but before we get there, what did you think of the young Joe Dunninger episode? Pretty interesting, wasn't it? A couple of those stories I have to credit to Maxine Dunninger. In fact, I dedicated episode 99 to her. I put that dedication into the show notes. Her book, Daddy Was a Mind Reader, is wonderful. It's out of print, but you can still find copies occasionally on eBay. The only drawback of her book is some of the dates are wrong and it's not exactly in chronological order. And when I was writing the script for the last episode, I realized it would be better if I put things in order to make the story more understandable. But even with that, I think I still got maybe one or two things misplaced. But her book was invaluable to the story. And by the way, Dunninger had two daughters, Maxine and Josephine. Maxine obviously named after his older brother Max. The other daughter named after Joe himself. Both passed away recently. There were other women in Dunninger's life, and I kind of have to sort all that out, exactly who they were and what relation they were to him, so that'll come in the future. I will eventually continue with the Dunninger story, but like Houdini, he's going to end up having multiple episodes, so just in order to cover him fully. So something to look forward to. Now, one more thing before the feature in honor of episode 100, a contest. Yes, a contest. The winner gets a piece of authentic magic ephemera. The question, are you ready? Are you ready? Write this down. Here's the question. What type of hat was Houdini photographed wearing or holding most often? In other words, Houdini has a ton of pictures of him wearing a particular type of hat, or he was holding this particular type of hat. What type of hat was it? No, it wasn't a top hat. I have seen 5 different hats worn by him. There could be more, but I'm looking for the one that was featured in most Houdini pictures where he's wearing a hat. So send your answer to info@carnegiemagic.com and put contest 100 in the subject line. Then include your answers and your address in case you win. And now to today's feature. Let me ask you a question. What happens when someone dies? Beyond the funeral and that sort of thing, what happens? The majority of people are forgotten over time. If they made substantial contributions to society, sometimes their story lives on. Sometimes they're forgotten, and it takes a historian or two to bring their story back to the masses. Let's look at Houdini for a moment. He was a vaudeville performer, an early motion picture star, a grand escape artist, a pioneer aviator, and more, but he wasn't Charles Lindbergh, nor was he even Charlie Chaplin, nor was he P.T. Barnum. And more to the point, he wasn't exactly a magician. He built his career on mostly being an escape artist. He could have, and probably should have, been forgotten over time. Yes, he was remembered by the magic community to some degree, but even then, nothing's guaranteed. And I don't mean to put Houdini down in any way. I just want to emphasize the fact that most people are forgotten a few years after they pass away. The reasons are many. A new generation of people are born unfamiliar with that person's exploits. The deceased is no longer in the news, whatever it happens to be. But we come to Houdini. That man remained in the press nearly every day since he died. In fact, Houdini died on October 31st, 1926. He had an article of his own that was published in November of 1926. Here's what William Larson Sr. had to say in the pages of Genie magazine, October 1936. Somehow, seeing Mrs. Houdini as often as we do, hearing laymen speak the name Houdini so often, and being questioned so frequently about him, we can't quite realize that Houdini is gone. Surely, 10 years should reconcile us to his departure, but it hasn't. When he went, magic lost something, an intangible something which it has never regained. Perhaps it was prestige that was lost, or a leader, or an idol. His wife, Bess, certainly did some things to keep his memory alive, but there was a point at which even she got tired of it. So in walks Dr. Edward Saint. He becomes the Houdini archivist. He begins to amass volumes and volumes of newspaper clippings about Houdini, and strangely, Houdini's name did remain in the press after he died. A great bit of it is due to Saint's own contributions and submissions. Houdini was no mere magician, no mere showman, no mere entertainer. But Edward Saint must be credited with helping to keep Houdini's name alive until it became legend. Today, let's look at the life of this unusual character, Dr. Edward Saint. He was born Charles David Myers in 1891. His show business career began rather early, according to a piece submitted by his father in the very first issue of Genie magazine, September 1936. At age 9, Edward Saint produced and managed a company of 20 performers for one particular afternoon performance. It began with a parade in the neighborhood and then followed with a show in the barn. The price for admission was a whopping 5 cents per person. The show grossed 70 cents. In other words, there were more people in the show than were watching the show. That is, unless all of the family members were comped, and then there could have been a lot more. The show consisted of clowns, tightrope walking, trapeze performers, jugglers, a trained dog, and more. Young Edward Saint wore a Chinese costume and performed 3 of the acts himself. He would continue this sort of backyard magic show concept throughout his youth. Eventually, Saint found his way into the carnival world, specifically the sideshows. Moving into this world, also, he created a new persona and look. One of his first incarnations was as Sir Edward St. Radim. You can see how easy it is to go from Sir Edward St. Radim to simply Edward Saint. The prefix would change occasionally, doctor, professor, etc., whatever worked best at the time. Sometimes he even changed the entire name. For a time, he was Professor Sesrod. A fascinating point was that Professor Sesrod usually wore a jeweled turban and had the appearance of a mystic. Even more fascinating, Sesrod is Sir Edward Saint Radim. The first letter of each name spells Sesrod. One of his early acts was playing the part of a deadpan man. He offered money to anyone who could make him laugh or smile. He worked for 6 years for the Johnny J. Jones Show as a psychic entertainer mentalist. He performed this act under the title of Sesrod. He shaved his Van Dyke beard for the act and wore a turban, as I just mentioned. He discovered that he appeared 30 years younger after shaving his beard, and it made it slightly more difficult to sell his act. Clearly, he preferred the Van Dyke as he grew it back and wore it for the rest of his life. In the 1930s, Saint could be found in Florida, and now he was presenting himself as a ghost hunter. Some sources would claim that this is where he met Bess Houdini. That is not exactly correct. It's likely that in Florida is where Bess and Saint reconnected, and he became her manager and in charge of the Houdini archives. There is an article by Edward Saint in the September 1979 issue of Mum magazine, and I'm assuming it appeared in another much earlier issue, probably around 1938. But the article is about the origins of National Magic Day, and it begins with stating, "I have the honor of recording the first publicized Houdini Day, which was celebrated in the summer of 1927 in New York City." Bess Houdini was present there because she was to give away a Houdini trophy to the winner of an underwater contest held at the Miramar Pool in New York. So the two met each other far earlier than I expected. Also, in the article, Saint shows how he pushed the idea of Houdini Day and National Magic Day to magic groups all over the country. Until now, we all recognize the date of Houdini's death as National Magic Day. There's an interesting story about Saint working in and on the Houdini archives. He would gather every bit and every mention of Houdini from newspapers, magazines, and whatever, and he'd put them in big giant scrapbooks. And Saint would do this while Mrs. Houdini usually played solitaire. On one particular evening, Bess turns to Saint and says, "Edward, why do you keep saving those articles on Harry? He is dead and buried. Why not leave him that way and quit digging him up all the time?" This is from January 1949 Conjurers magazine. Did you know that Dr. Saint actually had his own column in Genie magazine that started way back in October of 1936? It was called Through the Monocle, and much of the column featured magic news happening in California and the LA area, but it also contained a lot of Houdini stuff. For example, listen to this. Colonel Harry Day, Member of Parliament, just in from England, is visiting Mrs. Houdini at her Hollywood home. Colonel Day was Houdini's first manager in Europe. He arranged for the Scotland Yard breakaway and booked Houdini in England, Germany, and Russia, with engagements running months at a time. Colonel Day, riding the crest of Houdini's popularity, became himself a tremendous power in European theatricals. To quote Colonel Day, "Houdini and I were so closely connected both in business and friendship that I feel sure, had it not been for the fatal accident which unfortunately resulted in his death, I would still have retained my interest in the Variety Agency for the purpose of carefully managing his interest instead of embarking on a political career when I did." Also in 1936 is maybe the most iconic moment of Saint's life. Certainly his life with Bess Houdini, and that would be the 10th and final Houdini Seance. Wow, the 10th. If they only knew how many seances would happen after that. The event took place on the roof of the Hollywood Knickerbocker Hotel. Saint conducted the seance. Many notables were present for the event, and several within the inner circle, including Carl Fleming, the president of the Pacific Coast Association of Magicians, Judge Charles Fricke, a hard-nosed, no-nonsense judge of the California High Court and then president of the Southern California Assembly number 22 of the Society of American Magicians, also known as SAM. Len Oliver Gunn was an amateur magician and columnist for Genie magazine. Hereward Carrington, psychic investigator and amateur magician who worked with Houdini during the investigation of Marjorie the Medium for the Scientific American magazine. And by the way, you can learn more about him on episode 51 of my podcast. William Larson Sr., editor and publisher of Genie magazine. Jacob Hyman, original performing partner of Harry Houdini and friend since boyhood. Floyd Thayer, prominent magic dealer. Gerald Koski, national vice president for the SAM. Earl Reibold, who was a magician and collector and president of Los Magicos. Harry Mendoza, who was a stage magician and columnist for Genie. And on a side note, Mendoza's father was a manager for Frederick Eugene Powell. And two non-magicians included Reverend Dr. Korn of the local Association of Spiritualist Churches and Vernon Herbst, psychiatrist and student of the occult sciences. And finally, of course, Bess Houdini and Dr. Saint. There was a total of 300 invited guests at the event. Two ornate high-back chairs faced the crowd. The Hollywoodland sign could be seen clearly in the background. A shrine to Houdini with his photo sat between Bess and Saint. On the table were a number of items, including the mirror cuffs, a spirit trumpet, and various other items. Dr. Saint conducted the seance, and now you can listen to just a couple moments of the seance.
O thou disembodied spirits, those of you that have grown old in the mysterious laws of spirit land, we greet thee. We have gathered here at the appointed time. We have complied with all the requirements to enable all of you to make your presence known. Members of the spirit world have long known of the intention of this important gathering tonight. All is in readiness. Please now, the time is at hand. Make yourself known to us. Any of you, please, manifest yourself in any way possible. Please let your united strength and knowledge aid Houdini in coming through. It is the spirit of Houdini we wish to contact. Houdini, are you here? Are you here, Houdini? Please manifest yourself in any way possible. Take from this earnest gathering any strength that may be necessary for you to use.
As you may know, Houdini did not return, but the memory of the 1936 seance lives on. In fact, I have included the entire seance for you to listen to at the end of this podcast. So for those who'd like to hear it, after the closing remarks, you can hear the entire seance. But for now, let's get back to Dr. Saint. In another one of his Genie columns, Saint mentions coming across a bunch of letters in the Houdini archives, and these letters were from William Hillier's father to Houdini. And Saint had gathered them up in order to give them to Hillier, when, as it turned out the next morning, he heard the news of Bill's death at his own hand. Saint said, "A showman knows when an act is finished. It takes nerve to ring down one's own curtain, but I know Bill Hillier. He was a showman." In yet another column, he has some very prophetic words, and I do mean very prophetic words to the magic community. Quote, "Mr. and Mrs. Magus should start now to prepare for television. Magicians in general will get the real break in fame and money. It will be magic's first real comeback since vaudeville passed out. Take warning, prepare and be ready." In the next issue, Saint mentions he just completed a 10,000-mile motor trip around the United States: Hollywood, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Savannah, Miami, the Florida Keys, Tampa, Mobile, New Orleans, Galveston, Houston, El Paso, and back to Hollywood. Then he mentions later that Mrs. Houdini has made California her home. She is residing at 1851 Winona Boulevard in Hollywood. Here's a piece for my fellow Houdini historians. In the April 1937 issue of Genie, page 11, In Dr. Edward Saint's column, it reads, and I quote, Dr. Jake Hyman, old-time magician, recalling Houdini doing the bullet catch in 1893 and 1894. What? Yeah. And speaking of surprising, in his next column, we have a trick. It's called the Sesrod's Latest Trick. The effect? A borrowed cane or walking stick is held horizontally and a bright-colored ball is tossed in the air and caught by the magician. He next places the ball a few inches above the cane and lets go, and it appears to hover in mid-air. Even a hoop is passed over the floating ball. Finally, the ball is given a slap, sending it into the audience for inspection. Very interesting. In the same column is this gem. Quote, a number of years ago, Sesrod froze a man alive in a 1,400-pound block of ice at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., before an estimated crowd of several thousand. Sesrod had the time clocked from the time the subject was frozen at the ice plant miles away to the time the subject was chopped out under hospital supervision. Time in ice, 2 hours and 7 seconds. Every one of Saint's columns featured little bits of news, much like all the columns from that time period. Here, an example. Houdini is featured with Harry Gorfain's Jamboree Roadshow, 35 people. Not a lot of detail there, but it lets you know that Houdini is still working. He also mentions this. Judge Charles W. Fricke, magician and criminologist, lectures interestingly about magic and crime versus crime and magic. Now, there's a lecture I'd like to hear. And by the way, in 1937, the November issue of Genie magazine features none other than Dr. Edward Saint on the cover. January 1938, we learned that Houdini had secret marks in 2 places in each of his more valuable magic books. The marks are still there, according to Saint, but not sure the purpose other than for Houdini to identify them as his, I guess if he lent them out or if they were stolen, I guess. We also learned that, quote, a local spiritualist medium tried to take Mrs. Houdini for 40 grand recently. Part of that story went coast to coast. The New York Journal ran a photo. This is January 1938, if you want to dig further into that story. There's a mention of Robert Nelson, who owned the company that sold a ton of mentalism effects and props. He apparently wrote an expose of the Fox sisters' home and how it had been turned into sort of a sideshow at Lilydale. The article appears in the November Linking Ring, 1937. Saint says the story should be in the files of every psychic entertainer. February 1938, there is no regular column by Saint. Instead, there is an article titled I Challenge, and it has to do with what he refers to as the humbug of telepathy. He mentions tests made at college campuses and such, and the results showing no proof that the phenomenon is real. He's a bit harsh at times, referencing Dr. Ryan at Duke University and others on the proper way to conduct their tests. It's a fascinating article. Say what you want about Dr. Saint, he sure knows his stuff when it comes to this area of magic. Then in March 1938, he goes back to his regular column through the monocle. However, the entire piece seems to be a continuation of the article from the month prior, and it's not the standard monocle column at all. Then, April 1938, we see this. Answer to Dr. Saint by Wallace Lee. In his answer, he goes on to point out mistakes Saint made in his assertions and points out that he believes there is ESP telepathy, and it's been proven. And then in May 1938, Saint writes his final article for the magazine, Magicians on Guard, which further continues his message about no proof of real telepathy or ESP and further debunking of spirit mediums. John Booth shares an interesting story of a visit to Houdini's home in California. That's Bess Houdini's home. He said, I was absent-mindedly gazing up at a heroic-sized portrait photograph of Houdini on the wall opposite when I became aware of other voices in the room. They were coming from an indeterminate source. My friends, that would be Bess and Dr. Saint, stopped talking. We listened. And it was though radio voices had suddenly began to penetrate the air all around us. I was frankly puzzled, and I said so. But I noticed the trace of smiles in the expression of Mrs. Houdini and Mr. Saint. And then I recognized my own voice. Apparently, I was chatting with a woman. What? When did this happen? What was the subject? Where was the chatter even originating? And then I heard myself making a date with the woman, and she accepted. Of course, it was the recording of my telephone conversation with Madame Houdini the previous day. They had discreetly recorded that conversation, and apparently many others. Apparently, they were making a collection of records, Bess's conversations with various leading magicians. They had recorded 7 such records by that time. Now, after Bess passed away a short time later, Dr. Booth attempted to get these records, but they could not be found. They had been lost forever. It's interesting to note that many assumed Bess and Dr. Saint were of the same age. His Van Dyke beard, his immaculate way of dressing, and the fact he walked with a cane exaggerated his age. He was only 51 when he died. Bess was 67. The last days of Edward Saint's life were captured in a memorial piece by William Larson Sr. He mentions that the day Ed got sick, he was sitting in a chair directing Anna, who was Bess Houdini's housekeeper, directing her on how to iron his turban. An upcoming meeting of the local SAM assembly was having Oriental Night, and Ed had something special in store. Apparently, he never turned down an opportunity to perform. He was known to present very original material whenever he shared some magic. Sadly, the day Ed was supposed to attend the meeting, he instead was in the hospital. And ever the trooper, he still brought magic to show the nurses and doctors. Edward Saint, carnival man, Houdini archivist, showman, companion to Bess Houdini, passed away October 22nd, 1942. In the same piece by William Larson Sr., he mentions that all of the Saint's scrapbooks, where he had gathered countless stories about Houdini, were to go to the Library of Congress. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Magic Detective Podcast. I want to remind you that at the very end of the episode, I'll be posting the full 1936 seance. So after I bid farewell to everybody, you can continue listening to hear the seance. And don't forget the contest. In honor of episode 100, the winner gets a piece of authentic magic ephemera. The question is, what type of hat was Houdini photographed wearing or holding most often? In other words, Houdini has a ton of pictures of him either wearing a certain type of hat or holding it. What type of hat was it? I have seen Houdini wearing 5 different hats. There might be more, but I'm looking for the one that he was photographed with the most often. Send your answers to info@carnegiemagic.com. Put contest 100 in the subject line, then include your answer and your address in case you win. Until next time, my friends, I'm Dean Carnegie. I am the Magic Detective. Be well and stay safe.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this cathedral-like atmosphere tonight, I wish to remind you that this is a most solemn occasion for the close friends that have gathered here. That the 0 hour of the 10th anniversary of our departed friend is fast nearing the end, and that the results of tonight are primarily of a personal and private nature only. No attempt is being made to sway the world or to convince the skeptics one way or the other. This is a personal gathering aiding Mrs. Houdini in completing her 10-year vigil and to aid Mrs. Houdini and ourselves to a final and logical conclusion. Nor is it expected or intended that others must necessarily agree. But this last personal attempt to contact the spirit of Houdini has aroused interest throughout the world, and to that extent will the findings here tonight be publicly recorded. We wish it distinctly understood that in this last and final attempt, we are interested in Houdini coming to us instead of to a stranger. Should Houdini contact a stranger anywhere in the world tonight, we know that Houdini will leave proper identification. On behalf of Mrs. Harry Houdini, I wish to thank all members of the press, both local and worldwide, the various national magazines, and the hundreds of individuals throughout the world that have aided. I wish to thank the sincere friends in the four corners of the United States, Canada, and Europe in the forming of some 20 or more simultaneous seances coinciding with our final attempt here in Hollywood. I wish to thank the several hundred friends, trained observers, and several dozen renowned psychics and mediums that are present with us here tonight, and especially the past president of the California State Spiritualist Association present here tonight, whose kindly advice has been of great value. Every facility has been provided tonight that might aid in opening a pathway to the spirit world. Here in the inner circle reposes a medium's trumpet, a pair of slates with chalk, a writing tablet and pencil, a small bell, and in the center reposes a huge pair of silver handcuffs on a silk cushion. Facing the inner circle stands the famous Houdini shrine with its doors ajar. The world knows that the Houdinis were always open-minded regarding spirit communication. Houdini sought to communicate with his beloved mother after she passed on, but he found no evidence that he could rely upon. The Houdinis always believed that in their search, if you remove the fraud, what is left must be the truth. And they together were always seekers after truth. Before Houdini's death, the Houdinis made a compact that the first to go would try to contact the survivor. Houdini had promised to deliver a message in code to his wife, also to open the silver handcuffs and other signs if he should pass over first. It so happens that Mrs. Houdini survives, and she made it a sacred duty to carry out the terms of the compact. The first year found Mrs. Houdini every Sunday between the hours of 12 noon and 2 o'clock, locked up in the privacy of her own room, seated in front of Houdini's photograph, waiting for some sign of Houdini as prearranged in the compact. The truth regarding spirit communication was to Harry and Bessie Houdini a very sincere and profound question. During the following years, each anniversary of his death has been devoted to Houdini. During the last 10 years, there have been times that Mrs. Houdini felt that surely Houdini was coming through, that her hopes of communication would be fulfilled. She was willing to believe, but the evidence did not stand up. At no time has Mrs. Houdini ever received a psychic communication from Houdini, nor has anything occurred anywhere in the world that would lead Mrs. Houdini to believe that Houdini was trying to come through. Yet hundreds of alleged psychics and mediums have written in and stated that Houdini has appeared to them in some form or other, In Chicago, they said he walked boldly into a room. In Kansas City, Houdini was said to have written a long letter to Mrs. Houdini. In Long Beach, Houdini was said to have hypnotized the medium and then delivered a message through her. In New Zealand, he drank a cup of tea. And in Santa Monica, he escaped from several pair of handcuffs by dematerializing his hands. These things may be. Surely it is not for Mrs. Houdini to decide. But we all believe, and many prominent psychics agree, that if Houdini has appeared all over the world in spirit form, under every kind of manifestation, and doing this many times every week of every year of the last 10 years, then we believe that the great Houdini will, on this last authentic seance, come to the little silver-haired widow, the little lady who for 33 years stood by the side of her beloved Harry, listening to the applause of kings and emperors and the world at large. A few days before his death in Detroit, Houdini, in a most strong and firm reminder, again said, "Bess, darling, I'll come back to you if it is possible, even if I have to go through hell to do it." That was Houdini talking. Houdini was an editor of the old New York World. He was an honorary lieutenant of police and instructed a class of detectives and officers of the police force regularly in New York City. He was the author of many books, a writer of many magazine articles, a publisher of a national magazine, head of many magical organizations throughout the world, including societies in Berlin, London, and New York City, member of the exclusive Circumnavigators Club, the Masons, the Elks, and many others. He headed investigating committees that led him to appear on the floor of Congress at Washington, D.C. The Houdinis, Harry and Bessie, presented remarkable magic acts in the palaces of Europe and throughout the world. Houdini was working in secret with Thomas A. Edison on a delicate psychic detecting instrument and a process that would permit him to take flashlight photographs in the dark without the flash being visible. 1,000 interests had Houdini besides his search and collecting of rare first editions to make his library on magic and occultism the largest private collection in the world, which led to the creating of the Houdini Room in the Congressional Library in Washington, D.C. today. Houdini spent much time in aeronautics, wrote authoritatively on the subject, and was one of the first 17 flyers of the world, owned his own plane, and was the first man to ever successfully fly an aeroplane in Australia, winning the aerial trophy in Melbourne, Australia, March 15, 1910. That, in brief, was the man, Houdini. He had safes and vaults in his home and vaults and banks that his lawyers had access to. But one secret now made public for the first time is the fact that Houdini had one safe deposit vault in a bank or trust company in the East under some family name other than Houdini, and of which the secret location rested only in Houdini's brain. In this vault was kept highly secret papers, and into which was always placed a certain glass case of jeweled metals and a diamond question mark pin with a rare pearl drop, a gift from Harry Keller to Houdini. The jewel box was always on display in the Houdini home, but prior to closing the house to go on a vaudeville tour, Houdini always placed this box in the secret vault. Many things were left untold because of the unexpected death of Houdini in Detroit. There is a law, a time limit. Madame Houdini has year by year awaited word that the federal government had located or opened the box long overdue. Perhaps the vault rent had been paid years in advance. However, this secret vault has never been located to this day. No medium or psychic has ever brought forth information from Houdini or the spirit world touching on or leading to its discovery. So if any circle tonight in any city or town in the world believes they are contacting Houdini, let them identify themselves by bringing forth this information regarding the secret vault. Tonight, we are in the very heart of glamorous Hollywood that Houdini loves so well. He lived here. He worked here. Houdini loved Hollywood. And Harry and Bessie Houdini celebrated their 25th, their silver wedding anniversary here, and all the great of Hollywood were present. And Houdini made a speech and said, "You are all invited now to be at our 50th, our golden wedding ceremony." And Will Rogers got up and gave an impersonation and said, "Houdini, I'll be here, but this is the way I'll be coming in." And he walked like an aged old man with a cane. Will Rogers is gone. Houdini is gone. Nearly 2/3 of that famous gathering is gone. But this is the kind of a night they all would have loved. Nothing could have kept them away. It's a Houdini night, with the spotlight of the public on Houdini, with the whole world paused to see or hear Houdini step on this side of the curtain. Now let us bow our heads in meditation and prayer. O thou mastermind of the universe, please let the spirit of understanding descend upon us that are gathered here in the inner circle tonight. We are each in his own way seekers after truth. Please let thy spirit of understanding guide us and bring the light of truth to the many friends that have earnestly formed psychic circles and gatherings throughout the entire world. Aid us, guide us on this most important question to mankind, spirit communication from across the grave. We ask this universal understanding in all humbleness, and we offer our grateful thanks to thee. Guide us, please. Amen. O thou disembodied spirits, those of you that have grown old in the mysterious laws of spirit land, we greet thee. We have gathered here at the appointed time. We have complied with all the requirements to enable all of you to make your presence known. Members of the spirit world have long known of the intention of this important gathering tonight. All is in readiness. Please now, the time is at hand. Make yourself known to us. Any of you, please, manifest yourself in any way possible. Please let your united strength and knowledge aid Houdini in coming through. It is the spirit of Houdini we wish to contact. Houdini, are you here? Are you here, Houdini? Please manifest yourself in any way possible. Take from this earnest gathering any strength that may be necessary for you to use. Take any vital thing from us that you may need to enable you to carry out your promise of years ago. We have waited, Houdini, oh, so long. Never have you been able to present the evidence you promised. And now, this is a night of nights. The world is listening. Harry, your world, your audience. And Bessie is here. Your Bessie, who was part of you for 33 years. She's here, Harry, pleading in her heart for a prearranged sign from you. It means so much to her, to all of us, to the world. Harry, we are all seekers after truth. Please manifest yourself by speaking through the trumpet. Lift it Lift it. Speak through it. Speak. Speak, Harry. We are watching and waiting, Harry. Levitate the table. Move it. Lift the table. Move it. Rap on it. Spell out a code, Harry. Please. Ring the bell. Let its tinkle be heard around the world. Do it, Harry. Please. Please, Houdini, we are waiting. Bessie is waiting. Oh, thou spirit, your religion is based on love. And by that very token, a love of 33 years that have even entered into eternity, by that love I ask that you come through with the evidence. By the love of the little silver-haired widow, by the love and esteem of the countless friends, the evidence, Harry. And Houdini, Dash is listening in. Dash, Hardin, your brother has joined us with a circle. He is formed in New York City, 3,000 miles away. He has joined with us to seek the truth. And the circle in Baltimore, Philadelphia is listening in Providence, in Chicago, Leonard, who was once a protege of yours, a circle in Portland, Maine, and in the faithful city of Detroit, in Victoria, Canada, Tacoma, Rockford, Oakland, and San Francisco, all over the world, all joining in. Come through, Harry. And Houdini, Colonel Harry Day, member of the British Parliament, has formed a circle in London, England. Colonel Day was your closest boyhood friend. Houdini, you must come through. And at the bottom of the world, Australia, the country where you made history, has joined in. We are crying to high heaven, to the powers that be. We are crying in one mighty magnetic voice from every corner of the earth, and the hearts and minds of the multitudes are centered here tonight. We want the evidence, the truth, in the name of humanity and love. If there is communication from the great beyond, come through with the evidence.
Then followed calm and silent meditation, and again a tense and dramatic soul pleading, in which Mrs. Houdini joined Dr. Saint. But no sign from Houdini. At last Dr. Saint, in a voice that broke and filled with emotion, asked,
Mrs. Houdini, the 0 hour has passed. The 10 years are up. Have you reached a decision?
Yes. Houdini did not come through. My last hope is gone. I do not believe that Houdini can come back to me or to anyone. After faithfully following through the 10-year Houdini compact, using every type, medium, and seance, it is now my personal and positive belief that spirit communication in any form is impossible. I do not believe that ghosts or spirits exist. The Houdini shrine has burned for 10 years. I now reverently turn out the light. It is finished. Good night, Harry.
Beatrice Houdini turned, and with Dr. Saint left the room and stepped inside while the others waited respectfully at a distance.